Prohibition was the period from 1920 to 1933 when, by constitutional amendment, it was illegal to buy or sell alcohol in the United States. Women drove the institution of Prohibition. A woman was the top enforcement officer of it in the U.S. government, and then women drove the movement to repeal it. What does it say about us? Perhaps that we can admit that we're wrong. You recognize some of the women who were involved in the Prohibition movement. You've heard of them in other ways, and they include Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They were early leaders of what was then known as temperance, the temperance movement. They founded the Women's Temperance Society of New York State in 1852, so that's prior to the Civil War. But they became disillusioned because they asked to speak to the men's temperance groups like the Sons of Temperance, and they said, oh no, we don't want to hear from you women. So they decided that they would just take their toys and go home, and instead they worked for women's suffrage. The woman on the left is MABEL Walker Willebrandt, who was the Assistant Attorney General under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, and for a short time under President Hoover. And she was the one who led all the enforcement efforts of Prohibition. She was a household name. She was the highest ranking woman in the federal government. The woman on the right is Pauline Morton Sabin. She was what you would call a socialite. She was very wealthy, and she was a leading Republican who started a repeal organization that marshaled the forces of women to repeal Prohibition, which happened in 1933. On the left, you have a poster for Pauline Sabin's organization, the Women's Organization for the National Prohibition Reform, and then you have one that was early on about temperance, wet or dry. And in both cases, they were putting the needs of children first. They were saying, that we need to do these things, repeal Prohibition or institute Prohibition to protect the home and children, because their lives were held hostage to drunken men. In 1830, every American 15 years of age or over drank an average of 88 bottles of whiskey a year, or 7 gallons of pure alcohol. That's more than 3 times what Americans drink per capita today. But of course, most of the drinking in the 19th century was done by men. Women drank, but it was just not acceptable, and they had far fewer opportunities to drink. It was explicitly forbidden for a woman to get a divorce. Women had no property rights, they couldn't vote. If they left their husbands because they were drunks, the husbands got to keep the children. So they were just in a really bad fix. What was then called the temperance movement gained steam in the antebellum days. I mentioned that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started their group in 1852. But the problem was that the federal government had come into a very expensive project that needed a new source of revenue, and that project was the Civil War, funded by an excise tax on alcohol. And eventually, this excise tax brought in a third of federal revenue. And you have to remember, this is decades before there was an income tax. So the federal government had a vested interest in making sure Americans did a lot of drinking. After the war, things had still not gotten any better for women, and an unlikely activist came forward, Eliza Jane Thompson, and her son had died of drink, as they said. After hearing an inspiring sermon on temperance in December of 1873, Mrs. Thompson gathered a bunch of like-minded women from her church and her community, and they went out into the streets in front of places that sold drink, including a saloon and a pharmacy owned by a doctor who prescribed alcohol for medicinal purposes. And they knelt down in the snow and prayed. And this crusade so touched the doctor and some of the saloon owners that they closed their businesses. The doctor said, okay, I won't sell any more alcohol for medicinal purposes. And it led to the closing of more than 1,000 liquor outlets. And as soon as they got out of the streets praying and singing hymns, the saloons reopened. I hereby promise by the help of God, to abstain from the use of all intoxicating liquors, including wine, beer, and cider as a beverage, and the use of tobacco in any form, and from all profanity. So in other words, they weren't going to drink, smoke, dip, snuff, or swear. Now, realizing that they would get nowhere without empowering women to vote, the Women's Christian Temperance Union allied itself with the suffragists, with Susan B. Anthony and her crowd, and started pursuing a number of policy clauses that benefited women. These included a really shocking one. They wanted to raise the age of sexual consent from 10 to 16. And then under Mary Hunt, they created a publications arm for the WCTU that educated children about the dangers of drink. Their aim was to change the thinking of the next generation of Americans, so when they became voters, they would vote for temperance, for prohibition, for banning alcohol. 22 million children eventually got this information, and this arm became so powerful that school districts and state school organizations, governing organizations, put it into the curriculum. And some of the stuff these children were taught was just not true, wildly inaccurate. And one example was that drinking could cause spontaneous combustion of a human being. A Kansas woman who had been widowed by drink, who was the president of her WCTU chapter, went to a saloon and wrecked it. She smashed windows and the mirror over the bar, and she enjoyed it so much she started a one-woman crusade. Saloons had an important place in the lives of men. The writer Jack London described them as terribly wonderful places. Men would gather there not just to drink, but to socialize, play cards, blow off steam. America had an open-door policy for immigration then, and the people had come in droves from China, other places in Asia, but especially from Europe, from Ireland, from Germany, from Italy. And people were getting tired of all these immigrants who have come in with their strange ways and their strange languages, and among their strange customs were drinking. The Germans had a culture of drinking beer, the Italians had a culture of drinking wine, the Irish had a culture of drinking everything. And these strangers, as they called, were becoming more and more unwelcome. When World War II began, the Germans became especially hated, and people with German last names changed their names. The deciding factor, though, about the passage about Prohibition was the passage of another amendment, the 16th Amendment, which created the federal income tax. After that, the government was no longer so dependent on excise taxes on alcohol. And then the 18th Amendment was passed by Congress in late 1917. Now, it doesn't say you couldn't make alcohol in your own home, you just couldn't transport it anywhere. So there were certain exceptions, and people took advantage of these exceptions. Here's a big headline: U.S. has voted dry. So that announces that the 36th state had ratified it. And then women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, just in time for the 1920 presidential election. Now, when Prohibition was first passed, it seemed like it was going to do just what people thought it was going to do. But that didn't last long. There was money to be made in Prohibition. And very quickly, a huge underground market in illegal booze sprang up. People wanted to drink, and they would find a way to drink. But bootleggers want to have an underground market for alcohol, which corners the market. The Baptist or the Methodist or whichever group is opposed to alcohol consumption wants to ban it too. So they both want the same thing for different reasons. The Boston Herald held a contest for a word that described those who ignored Prohibition and drank anyway. And the winning word was scofflaw, someone who scoffs at the law. And unfortunately, the scofflaw in chief was the President of the United States, Warren G. Harding. Warren Harding was a Republican. The Republicans were very much on the dry side in their policies. His Attorney General sold pardons, and the Attorney General, who had also gotten the nomination for Harding and to whom he owed his job, had an aide who provided permits to producers of medicinal alcohol and took kickbacks from those producers. Harding did one thing that was important, and that was appoint an able person to enforce the Volstead Act, which was the law governing prohibition enforcement enforcement. She was Mabel Walker Willebrandt, organized her own squadron of lawyers, infiltrating a rum-running operation in Mobile and Savannah that resulted in 72 convictions, and she also brought down the king of the bootleggers, as he was called, George Remus. But Mabel was very badly outnumbered and very badly outgunned. There was just too much money to be made in selling booze. Congress didn't adequately fund her policing, and most states and municipalities said, wait, this is a federal law. We don't want to have to go put our resources after this. They went to illegal bars called speakeasies, where for the first time, women were welcome. They bought booze in drugstores with prescriptions written by their doctors. People could also make a certain amount of wine or beer in their homes for their own consumption, and they were making quite a bit of this stuff and selling it to their neighbors. And unless they got caught, this was a nice little source of income for them. So very soon, people were drinking just as much alcohol as they had before Prohibition started. By 1928, it was obvious that Prohibition wasn't working as planned, and it became an issue in one of the ugliest presidential campaigns in memory. The Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. The Democrats nominated Al Smith. He was a Roman Catholic, and he was a wet. During the Democratic National Convention, Mabel Willebrandt jumped into the fray. She orchestrated raids of New York speakeasies to embarrass Smith. And she went to not just the low-class speakeasies, she went to the ones where the hoity-toity people went in their tuxedos and evening gowns. And so they were being arrested, paraded out into the streets, loaded into paddy wagons, and this was all done to embarrass Smith just as he was getting the nomination. Willebrandt went on. She whipped up anti-Catholic fervor at a conference of 2,000 Methodist ministers, and she urged them to preach in their pulpits against Smith. Well, for whatever reason, Hoover won in a landslide. Mabel Willebrandt had hoped to be rewarded by Hoover for her service to his campaign by being named Attorney General. Instead, he went to her and asked her if she would come up with a short list of nominees for Attorney General and not include herself. So she came up with the list, he appointed a man, and she resigned and went into private practice. One of her first clients was the California Fruit Industries Limited, which produced a grape concentrate called Vine Glow, which could be made into grape juice, or it could easily be turned into wine. In fact, it had instructions on the label about what not to do so you would not accidentally turn this product into wine. She later converted to Catholicism. October 24th, known as Black Thursday, we were plunged into what was known as the Great Depression. A woman named Ella Boole was by then president of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was very pleased at Hoover's inaction, and speaking at a congressional hearing, she said, "I represent the women of America." One of the women hearing this speech was our society socialite, Pauline Morton Sabin, and she thought to herself, well, lady, here's one woman you don't represent. Now, interestingly enough, Pauline Sabin was a Republican, and a very prominent one. She was the first woman chosen to serve on the Republican National Committee. She was a formidable fundraiser. She had initially supported Prohibition because she had two sons, and she thought that it would be helpful to her children. She thought, I thought a world without liquor would be a beautiful world. But by 1928, she changed her mind. She had a beautiful estate on Long Island called Bayberry Land, and whenever she had politicians as guests who were professed to be dries, they would come into her house and demand to have drinks, say, hey, where you got the booze hid? And because she did have booze hidden in her house, she had to pull it out. And she realized that Prohibition was not working, not only in her household, but everywhere else. She said, today in any speakeasy in the United States, you can find boys and girls in their teens drinking liquor. And this situation has become so acute that the mothers of the country feel something must be done to protect their children. So you've got the same argument that we had about enacting Prohibition, we need to protect our children. So here is a billboard that they came up with: Prohibition failed. Please do something about it. And this woman with her arm around her little girl. Pauline founded her organization in 1929, and she immediately got to work. First, she rounded up a bunch of her society friends who agreed with her about Prohibition, and then they opened the doors to this organization to any woman, and eventually 1.5 million women too did this, far outpacing the WCTU. In the 1930 election, Sabin's organization backed wet candidates, and that meant Democrats because that was part of their party platform. In 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt was the nominee, unemployment was at 25%, the banking system was about ready to go over a cliff, people were desperate, but the biggest hoopla, a plank to repeal Prohibition, and that was passed as part of the platform. So FDR won in a landslide. He carried 42 of the 48 states and all but 59 electoral votes. Congress passed a resolution proposing the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. 9 days after taking office, FDR asked Congress to tweak the Volstead Act to allow for the legal sale of 3.2% beer, and it passed. At this point, the 100 days was going on, and everything FDR sent to Congress passed without a murmur of dissent. So the Anheuser-Busch Company delivered a case of beer to the White House in thanks. How they produced it so quickly, I don't know. But the bars were full of people hoisting their beer mugs and singing "Happy Days Are Here Again." It was thought that ratification was going to take another couple of years, but it took just a few more months. December 5th, 1933, the amendment was ratified. There were a few holdouts. South Carolina voted down ratification, and Prohibition continued in Mississippi until 1966. But the crime syndicates wound down and found new ways to make money illegally, and the whole alcohol and beer and wine industries were revitalized, which provided a lot of jobs. Prohibition had changed the culture for women. Before Prohibition, a woman would never have been seen in a saloon, a nice woman that is. It was just a place for men, but they had gotten used to going to speakeasies and drinking in the back of parked cars and all sorts of other things, so they could go into most bars without being considered immoral or loose. They could order wine in a restaurant. After Prohibition ended, it became harder in some ways to get a drink than before. The states took over enforcement of Prohibition, and there's this tremendous patchwork of laws. In Anderson County, for example, until earlier this year, you could buy beer and wine at the Buy Low in Pendleton on Sunday, but you couldn't buy it in Anderson. Pendleton had a local ordinance that allowed it. Anderson didn't, but then a countywide ordinance was passed. And this goes on all that. There are periods of time that liquor stores have to be closed. There are periods of time when you can't serve alcohol in a bar or restaurant. Alcohol continues to blight lives, alcoholism. Alcoholics Anonymous was formed in 1935, just 2 years after Prohibition was ratified, in response to the cost of alcoholism on persons, their families, and society. There are many other groups and approaches for dealing with alcoholism: rehab centers, psychiatry, even medicine that makes you not want the alcohol. There are lots of ideas about what to do about the problem of over-imbibing, but they don't include Prohibition anymore. It remains the only attempt by the federal government to regulate or legislate morality. The 18th remains the only constitutional amendment that was ever repealed. Now, interestingly enough, the Women's Christian Temperance Union still exists, and the women who join it still pledge not to drink alcohol in any form, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use and traffic in the same. However, they no longer have to promise not to swear. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will all come to visit the interesting exhibit at the museum on moonshine and the history and tradition of moonshine in Anderson County in South Carolina. There is a still and a lot of other interesting memorabilia there, and our museum is free and open to the public, so I hope you take advantage of it. Thank you very much.
Interesting.